There were three guys, and they were hiking through a wilderness area, and they came to a place where there was a ford in a river, a crossing, but the river was in flood terribly, and they didn't know how they'd get across. So the first one prayed to God to give him strength to cross the river, and he felt God's power pulsing through his arms and legs. He jumped in the river and started swimming. The river was just raging, and he tumbled over, but managed to keep on swimming. It took him half an hour. He got out 10 miles downriver, but he made it across. The second guy, seeing what happened, prayed to God to give him strength and equipment, and he had a kayak. And so he got in the kayak and he started paddling across, again, raging river, and he was flipped over several times, disoriented, but managed to paddle to the other side. Took him about 10 minutes, and he ended up a mile downriver. The third guy prayed that God would give him strength and equipment and intelligence. And immediately up popped a telephone, and he was turned into a woman. He called God directions, hiked 100 yards upriver, and crossed onto the bridge. I wanted a laugh track. We don't have a laugh track, but there was a long line at the pearly gates to heaven. A whole bunch of people waiting a long time in line, and St. Peter was there at the front, going ahead and interviewing. So he went next. An elderly woman came up, and St. Peter says, "I hope you didn't mind waiting in line." She said, "Oh no, this is just amazing to be here. I am so thankful. I have been trying to follow Jesus all my life and caring for people and sharing God's love, and I know I haven't done it perfectly and don't deserve to be here, but thank you." St. Peter says, "Just one question. If you answer correctly, you can come in. How do you spell God?" She said, "G-O-D. Come on in." So then the next person came. St. Peter says, "Next," and a young man comes up. And the young man goes ahead, and St. Peter says, "I hope you didn't mind waiting so long." "Oh no," says a young man, "I don't even deserve to be here. You see, as a youth, I was destructive to myself and so many other people. I caused so many problems. And someone told me that God still loved me. And for me to have the chance to come here and to be here is just, I am so grateful." St. Peter says, "Just one question, answer correctly, you come on in. How do you spell God?" G-O-D. Come on in. St. Peter then said, "Next." Middle-aged guy comes up. St. Peter says, "I hope you didn't mind waiting." The man says, "Didn't mind? This was awful. My whole life, I've been doing the right thing. I've been helping poor people even though they don't deserve it. I've been going ahead and caring for all these miserable people, being part of a church where nobody lives up to my standards. I come here and I have to wait." St. Peter says, "Just one question, answer it correctly, and you come in." "What is it?" "How do you spell hepatocholangioscystoduodenostomy?" I heard a joke about this guy who was taking a ride with a cabbie in New York. He hops into the cab, says where he's going, and he's quiet. The cabbie's sort of distracted, whistling, and they're driving for quite a while. And then he reaches forward, taps the cabbie on the shoulder. The cabbie screams, swerves off the road, just about hits a light pole, is there visibly shaken. And the guy in the back says, "Are you okay? What happened?" The cabbie turned back and says, "You have to realize this is my first day on the job. For the last 20 years, I've been a funeral hearse driver." Thank you. I need a laugh track for this. There's a story of these two guys, Jimmy and Johnny, who grew up together, and they both loved baseball. One was pitcher and one was catcher on their high school team. They were pitcher and catcher on their college team. When they got out in the workforce, they would play recreationally together. They always went down to Florida for spring training and followed baseball avidly, and they wondered, was there baseball in heaven? And they made a promise to each other. The first one to get to heaven would go ahead and let the other person know, try to find some way to communicate to the other person if there was baseball in heaven. The day came, Johnny died, and Jimmy was very sad and grieving. About a week later, Jimmy was sitting in his house and suddenly he hears a voice. Who is that? It's Johnny. Seriously, you came back? Yes. Well, what about baseball? Well, I've got good news and bad news, says Johnny. What's the good news? Johnny says, there is baseball, and it's wonderful. The fields are incredible. The teams are competitive. They choose them, and we play each day with crowds cheering. It's amazing. Wow, says Jimmy. And what's the bad news? Johnny says, you're scheduled to pitch tomorrow. All right. There was a dinner in the home of a retired couple. Their best friend was staying with them, and the couple was hosting this meal. The wife would go out to the kitchen periodically, and the husband was just so affirming. He'd say, thank you, honey. This meal is wonderful, sweetheart. Dear, this has been great. And one time when the wife was out in the kitchen, the friend asked the husband, said, wow, this is amazing how you keep your love alive in that way, and how you use all these wonderful pet names for her. The husband looked at him and says, well, if I can confess, actually, I use those names because I keep forgetting what a real name is. There's this woman driving along a road, and she's racing along, and a bunny comes running out. And the bunny jumps up and she hits it with the car. The bunny's lying there on the road and she's freaking out. She gets out and a woman comes from a car in the other direction, stops and says, is it okay? Don't worry about it, says the driver. I've got an idea. She goes back to the trunk, opens up the trunk, goes in a cosmetic case, takes out a spray, comes up, sprays it on the bunny. Suddenly the bunny jumps up, goes like this, goes jumping to the edge of the road, jumping to the edge of the woods, and out. The driver of the other car says, that's amazing. What was that? Hair restorer with permanent wave. Yes. There was a brand new pastor, and she was starting in a congregation and trying to visit everybody. One day she decided she was going to visit this elderly woman. She heard this woman was very witty and also knew her Bible well. So the young pastor goes, she knocks on the door, no answer, but she thinks she hears something inside. She goes walking through a path through the garden to the back door and knocks again, still thinks she hears somebody, but nobody's coming to the door. So she goes back, and on her business card, she writes, Revelation 3:20. It's, behold, I stand at the door and knock. She goes ahead and puts that there at the house. The next Sunday, after the service, the elderly woman whose house had been visited gives a card to the young pastor. The young pastor looks at it. It's Genesis 3:10. She goes and looks up. It says, I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, for I was naked, so I hid myself. You've probably seen a whole bunch of memes and jokes going around about this time of quarantine and isolation, and I had a couple that I was just going to share that some of you have no doubt already seen, but I liked. With the homeschooling that's needed, tomorrow is the National Homeschool Tornado Drill. Lock your kids in the basement until you give the all clear. You're welcome. Or, I was so bored I called Jake from State Farm just to talk to someone. He asked me what I was wearing. Or, this virus has done what no woman has been able to do. Cancel all sports, shut down all bars, and keep men at home. And there are a couple. Connect with the pets. You might have heard at the end of the children's sermon, our dog whining a little bit. She wanted to be part of that. The dog is looking at me like, see? This is why I chew the furniture. Can everyone please just follow the government instructions so we can knock out this coronavirus and be done? I feel like a kindergartner who keeps losing more recess time because of one or two kids who can't follow directions. Can relate to that. And one final dog one. Quarantine has turned us into dogs. We roam around the house all day looking for food. We're told no if we get too close to strangers, and we get really excited about car rides. Since it's Good Shepherd Sunday, I wanted to start off with a couple little jokes about sheep and teachers. The first one, the teacher is asking little Eva, okay, Eva, if I gave you one sheep and then I gave you 2 sheep, how many would you have? Eva says 12. No. If I give you 1 sheep and then I give you 2 sheep, how many would you have? 12 sheep. Teacher says, what's 1 plus 2? 3. What do you mean 12 then? Well, I have 9 sheep at home already. Or another one where the teacher is talking to little Taylor and she says to Taylor, if you had 12 sheep in a pen and 6 jumped out, how many would be left in the pen? Taylor says, none. The teacher says, you don't know math. Taylor says, you don't know sheep. There was a little girl who came up to the pastor after Sunday service. Everyone was greeting the pastor, and the little girl came up and she said to the pastor, when I grow up, I'm going to get a good job and I'm going to give you some money. The pastor said, why, thank you. That's wonderful. Why are you going to do it? She says, well, because I heard my dad saying that you're the poorest preacher we've ever had. Don't laugh too loud for that one. Anyway, there was an evangelist who was going to be preaching at a big revival in a very rural area. And the evangelist had a little time in the afternoon and wanted to drop off some cards in the post office. He was driving along. He saw a youth walking along the road, rolled down the window and said, hey, son, can you tell me how to get to the post office? The boy told him, just go down till you get to the stop sign, turn left, it'll take you into town, and the post office is on the right. Thank you, said the evangelist. And by the way, I'm preaching at a revival tonight at the Methodist Church. Why don't you come by and I'll tell you how to get to heaven? No thanks, said the boy. You don't even know how to get to the post office. It was council president searching around the church, needing to get into a safe where there was petty cash, but not knowing the combination. So he went to the pastor and asked her if she knew the combination. She said she thought she might be able to get it. And so she went with him to the safe, opened up the door, looked at the safe, then looked up, paused, and then opened the safe. The council president was just amazed. He says, wow, what sort of prayer did you have? She said, actually, it wasn't the prayer. The combination's written on the ceiling right up there. I wanted to share with you a couple signs that I had come across that were cleverly done in a non-smoking area. If we see smoke, we will assume you are on fire and we will take appropriate action. In a vet waiting room, be back in 5 minutes, sit, stay. Or in the front yard of a funeral home, drive carefully, we'll wait. I thought there's some wisdom there. At the electric company, we would be delighted if you would send your payment on time. If you do not, you will be delighted. There's a story I heard of an elderly Jewish man who was in a deli in New York, and he had soup there, and he says, waiter, taste this soup. The waiter says, what's wrong with it? No, taste this soup. The waiter says, what, is it too salty? No, come taste this soup. Why, is it too cold? Would you just taste this soup? Okay, says the waiter. Where's the spoon? Aha. There's a joke about a mother who woke her son up and says, honey, hurry up, church starts in an hour. Her son looked up and says, Mom, I don't want to get up. Her mom says, why? He says, 2 reasons. I hate getting up early and nobody there likes me. The mother says, you have to go. The son says, why? She says, 2 reasons. You're 55 years old and you're their pastor. There was a preacher who died and went to heaven, and he was waiting in line as St. Peter was letting people in. Right in front of him was a taxi cab driver. And St. Peter says to the taxi cab driver, all right, where did you drive? New York City. Come on in, says St. Peter. And he shows him this beautiful 2-story house that's just gorgeous and says, this is your home. Then he says to the preacher, come on in.
And he shows him a little sort of rundown bungalow. And the preacher says, "Hey, what gives? I spent my whole life preaching and teaching about God, and you give this taxi driver a better place than me?" And St. Peter says, "Hey, when you were preaching and teaching, people were sleeping. When that taxi driver was driving, people were praying. It's about results." There was a couple who came into a gardening store, and they asked the person, they said, "We're just having trouble growing a garden, and we can't get anything to look good. Can you help us?" And the gardener said, "Well, describe your conditions." "Well, it's under the trees. There's no direct light anywhere. There's a hard clay soil. We have a ton of rabbits and deer." The gardener says, "I got just the thing for you. Aisle 3, flagpoles and bird baths." I was trying to look up some jokes about weeds and wheat, and when you start looking up jokes about weed, you get all sorts of jokes that you don't want to use. But I found some ways to distinguish between weeds and good plants. If you want to know what the good plant is, tug lightly on each of them. If it comes out, it's a good plant. Or if you want to know what the weed is, go ahead and pull both of them out. If it grows back, it's a weed. G.K. Chesterton and some other authors were in a room, and they were talking, and someone brought up the question, if you were stranded on a deserted island and you could have only one book, what would you choose? One person without hesitation said, "I'd choose the complete works of Shakespeare." Another person said, "I would choose the Holy Bible." They looked at Chesterton. He paused and he said, "Stranded on a deserted island, one book? I think I'd choose Thomas's Guide to Practical Shipmaking." There was a woman leading a birthing class, and she had the expectant moms there and their husbands or partners gathered with them. And as she was talking, she said, "Now, those who are going to be giving birth, it's really important for you to know that you need to exercise. That is going to help. And the best exercise you're going to do is go for long walks, but a lot of rest, sort of break it up so you don't do the whole thing at once. And you can walk on a pavement or a sidewalk, but it's better to walk on a softer, grassy surface." And she looked out and she said, "Now, all the rest of you, husbands and everyone else, it's important for you to go ahead and be part of this, and so you can join her in that walk." You could tell one of the guys was thinking about it from the back. His hand went up. She says, "Yes." He says, "When I'm walking with my wife on the grassy surface, is it okay if she carries my golf bag?" There was a Coast Guard student, and the teacher was quizzing him. He says, "You're out in the middle of the ocean in a boat, and a storm comes up from the starboard side. What do? Throw out an anchor on the starboard. Okay, now a storm comes in from the port side. What do? Throw out an anchor on the port side. Okay, now if a storm comes in from the bow, what do? I throw out an anchor on the bow side. Hold on a second, where are you getting all these anchors? Same place you're getting all those storms, sir." It was a rural community, a meeting of farmers, almost all guys there. And as they were meeting, there was one woman there, and she stood up and started to talk. One of the guys stood up and said, "Mabel, go ahead and sit down. You don't even know anything about that. I bet you don't even know how many toes on the foot of a pig." She just looked at him and said, "Frank, why don't you take off your shoes and count for yourself?" There was a cowboy and a geologist and a minister who were there at the Grand Canyon, looking over the Grand Canyon. And the minister went, "Wow, what an absolute witness to the amazing Creator." And the geologist went, "Wow, what an incredible example of erosion over time." And the cowboy went, "Wow, what a terrible place to lose a cow." There was a couple that was planning on going out to eat, and they'd called a taxi, and as they were getting ready, the husband went and put the covering over the parakeet cage and then took the cat and put her out in the backyard, because if they were gone, the cat terrorized the parakeet. As they were leaving to go to the taxi, the cat shot back in the house. And so the wife said, I'll just go to the taxi. You go take care of the cat. She went out to the taxi driver and didn't want the taxi driver to know that there was going to be no one in the house. So she said, my husband is taking care of my mom. He'll be out in a second. Well, 5 minutes later, the husband comes out. He's sweating. He's all sort of tattered and he's fuming. And the wife asks, what happened? He says, I searched the house and found that old girl under the bed. I had to poke her out with a broomstick. She wouldn't come out, and then she started scratching me. I grabbed her, I wrapped her in a blanket, took her out, threw her in the backyard, locked the door. She is not getting in the house until we get home. The taxi driver fainted. There was a man who went to a pharmacist, and he says, do you have something that'll cure the hiccups? The pharmacist leaned across the counter, slapped the man. He said, what did you do that for? You don't have the hiccups, do you? No, but my wife probably still does. There were 3 city slickers out in the country, and they were walking through the woods when they came across some tracks, and the one said, I think those are deer tracks. The second one said, I think those are wolf tracks. The third one said, I think those are bear tracks. And they started arguing with each other. Deer tracks, no. Wolf tracks, no. Bear tracks. And they were still arguing when the train hit them. Apparently it was train tracks. There are these 2 guys, Frank and Joe, and Frank is about to go parachuting for the first time ever, skydiving. So Joe's on the ground, Frank is up at 10,000 feet, and they're communicating, and Joe says, go ahead, Frank, jump out of the plane. Frank jumps 10,000, 9,000, 8,000, 7,000, 6,000 feet. Joe said, Frank, pull the ripcord. 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000 feet. Joe's getting really worried. Frank, pull the ripcord, pull the ripcord. 500, 400, 300, 200, 100 feet. And Joe's going nuts. Frank, pull the ripcord. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 feet. Frank is insane. Pull the ripcord. Joe is insane. Pull the ripcord. Frank looks around from 10 feet and says, what for? I can jump from here. There was a little girl who went up to her mom and said, Mommy, I have a tummy ache. And the mom says, honey, that's because you didn't have breakfast this morning. Your tummy is empty. And when your tummy is empty, it's going to ache like that. Here, have some food. You'll feel better. The little girl eats some food. She gets better and she learns her lesson. That next Sunday, they're at church. And after worship, the pastor's talking to him and goes, I have a headache. And the little girl says, my mommy says that's because your head is empty. There was a boy who had just turned 16. He went to his dad and he said, Dad, can I drive the car now? And the dad said, 3 rules before you do that. First of all, your grades are awful. You get those grades up first. Second, I want you to be reading the Bible every day. That's important for you. And third, your hair. It's just too long. You gotta get a haircut. So a couple months later, the son comes up to his dad, gives him the report card. Dad looks at it, says, your grades came up, 1 out of 3. He says, Dad, I've been reading the Bible every day. Dad says, that's 2 out of 3, but your hair's still long. You got to do something with that. The boy's ready. He says, Dad, Jesus had long hair, and nobody criticized him. You're right, says Dad, and he walked everywhere he went. There was somebody taking a trip, getting on a plane in first class, and she sat right down next to another woman who had her hand out, and there was this enormous ring. She looked at the ring and she says, is that a real diamond? Oh, yes, said the woman. This is the world famous Klopman diamond. It's one of the largest in the world, but it comes with a curse. Really, said the traveler. What curse? Mr. Klopman. There was a little girl who was playing with a coin. She was flipping it up, and it landed in her mouth, got lodged in her throat. She started choking, and the mother screamed, can anyone help? Immediately, a man in a suit jumped up, boom, popped that coin right out. And the mother went, you got that coin out so fast. Are you a doctor? No, he says, I work for the IRS. There was a pastor in a small country church, and he'd been there about 5 years. He was looking through the books and seeing that the previous 5 pastors had only lasted about a year, year and a half. And he was thinking, what was it about him that allowed him to thrive, to last so much longer? And so he pulled one of the elders aside and says, I was just wondering, they only lasted a year and a half. I've been here 5 years. What do you think? What about my qualities? The guy looked at him, no nonsense, and says, well, preacher, he says, folks around here really don't care for a pastor, and you're about as close to nothing as we've been able to get. It was Halloween night, and there was a little boy who was trick-or-treating with his grandma. He had his Superman pajamas on. His grandma had the big bag of candy. He went up to a house and said, trick-or-treat. Miss Wilson was there, and she looked at that and said, how come your grandma's carrying the candy? Why aren't you carrying the candy? He says, oh, it's too heavy for me. She says, aren't you Superman? He leans forward and says, I'm not really Superman. This is just my pajamas. There was a pastor and his wife and their little daughter who were driving to Grandma and Grandpa's, and they've been driving for a while, and then the question comes from the little girl in the back seat. Are we there yet? The dad says, no, we've got 150 miles to go. Well, how long is that? Well, that's about 2.5 hours. How long is that? That's a long time. The little girl's trying to figure this out. She turns and looks at her mom. Mommy, is that as long as one of Daddy's sermons? There was a terrible car accident. An Eagles fan and a Giant fan had collided, and the cars were a mess, but miraculously the two drivers got out relatively unhurt, a little dazed. The Eagles driver looks over at the Giant driver and says, I can't believe that we survived. God must somehow want us to overcome our differences and be friends. And the Giant fan sort of nods, and the Eagles fan says, and I can't believe this. He says, car's almost totaled, but this brand new bottle of whiskey didn't even get damaged at all. God must want us to share a drink in celebration and thanks. The Giant fan nodded. Eagles fan takes the lid off, gives it to the Giants fan, who takes several big gulps, gives it back to the Eagles fan, who puts the lid back on. Giant fan says, aren't you going to drink that? Eagles fan says, no, I think I'll sit here and wait for the police to come and do the report. Little Johnny came running into the house crying like crazy, and his mother said, Johnny, what's wrong? And Johnny went, I was out with Dad in the workshop, and he was hammering a nail, and he hit his finger. And the mother says, that's nothing to cry about. You should have laughed. That's what I did. There were two guys up in Minnesota who decided they were going to go ice fishing for the first time, and they bought all their equipment. They bought the tip-up fishing gear and the little stools to sit on and the big ice auger to go through the ice. And they found the place that they wanted to start fishing, and they get the auger and are ready to start going through the ice, and there's a voice from heaven saying, there are no fish under the ice there. They figure, okay, we might as well follow God. So they go to another spot in the ice. They get ready to start cutting the hole through. And again, a voice from the heavens. There are no fish under the ice there. They pack up. They go to a third spot. They're ready to start cutting through. And a third time, the voice from the heavens. This is the hockey rink manager. There are no fish under the ice there. If you're my age or older, you'll remember Rodney Dangerfield from the 70s and 80s with a comedian who always talked about, I don't get no respect. I can't get no respect. And he's got a couple lines. I get no respect at all. My mom took me to a dog show and I won. I get no respect. One time I was kidnapped. The kidnappers cut off a piece of my finger, sent it to my father. My father said he wanted more evidence. I don't get no respect. I told the psychiatrist, everyone hates me. The psychiatrist said, that's not true at all. Not everybody's met you yet. Or, I don't get no respect. When I was a kid, I lost my parents at the beach. I asked the lifeguard to help me find them. The lifeguard says, I don't know, kid. There's so many places they could hide. I know I've used this joke before, but it just fits too perfectly here, so I have to use it again. There's this older woman coming out of a store as it closes, and she's looking in the parking lot, and there are just a couple cars there. She goes to her car and realizes with horror she's locked her keys in the car. She doesn't know what to do. There's a gruff, sort of burly guy coming to a car nearby, and desperate, she says, "Sir, can you help me? I locked my keys in my car. Any way that you can do so?" He says, "Just a sec, ma'am." He goes into his car, gets out a couple tools, fishes it down the car window. 10 seconds, car's open, says, "There you are, ma'am." She says, "Thank you. I just have to pray. God, thank you for sending this wonderful angel to me in my time of need." The guy looks at her and says, "Ma'am, I'm no angel. I just got out of prison last year serving 7 years for car theft." She goes, "God, thank you for not only sending an angel, but sending a professional." There was a high school coach who was beloved by all of the students and did a wonderful job working with them. He was at his home and getting his sidewalk redone. And he looked out, and there in the fresh sidewalk were handprints, and he saw a couple kids running away. They just put their hands in his sidewalk. And he starts screaming and yelling at them, and someone says, "Coach, I thought you loved kids." And he says, "I love them in the abstract. I do not love them in the concrete." A couple weeks ago, somebody sent me a bunch of one-liners, wise sayings, and I knew I would be using some of those this evening. There's some vocab. If you can't think of a word, say, "I forget the English word for that." That way people will think you're bilingual instead of an idiot. Or more vocab. So if a cow doesn't produce milk, is it a milk dud or an utter failure? How about a reality check? We can all agree that in 2015, not a single person got the answer correct to, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" Some truth to that. Or another reality check with vocab on it. Corona coaster. This is a noun. Corona coaster. The ups and downs of a pandemic. One day you're loving your bubble, doing workouts, baking banana bread, and going for long walks. And the next you're crying, drinking gin for breakfast, and missing people you don't even like. Actually, there's probably a lot more truth to that than most people would like. Or this one, final one here. At one point, are we just going to start using 2020 as profanity? As in, that's a load of 2020. Or what, the 2020? I've actually been trying to do that around the house to see if it picks up. So far, my wife and daughter aren't into that.